here, we first our first thinking was about the Scotland, because the cátedra on the population of the University of Zaragoza, in fact, has since 3 years ago, more or less, an agreement with the Academic Advisory Board of the Scottish Government. So we have had a kind of strong relationship. So Mike is the second time coming to Zaragoza. I went also to Edinburgh some years ago. So the idea is that we know pretty well how they work, and we like the Scottish approach to population issues. So we think that it would be interesting to discuss and to know this Scottish experience. Our second choosing was the Scandinavian countries, because also the Scandinavian countries share with Spain some common characteristics, like a very low density of population in rural areas, and also they have developed in the last 20 years at least an interesting also approach to this issue. So we also thought that was interesting to learn about this experience. So I'm first going to introduce our two guests, Mike Andrews and Hilma Salonen, and vale, en el canal de YouTube de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad de Zaragoza se está retransmitiendo por streaming esta sesión, por si queréis avisar a la gente que no ha podido venir. I'm saying that this roundtable is been broadcasting by the YouTube channel of the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de Zaragoza. Well, coming back to our guest, I'm first going to introduce Hilma. Hilma is a social scientist and whose work focuses on sustainability, transitions, resilience politics, and rural and regional development. She's original from Finland, but she works in Norregio. Norregio is a research institute that focuses in the whole Nordic countries. And in fact, I'm not wrong, is founded by the Nordic Council. So she will give us a general idea about how these different Scandinavian Nordic countries are facing this depopulation and rural development in the Scandinavian peninsula mostly. And then I'm going to introduce Mike Andrews. Mike Andrews is team leader at the Scottish Government. If I'm not wrong, the name of your administrative office was Scottish Population Task Force, or it was in the past at least. This was the name, and he's working mostly on all the issues related to the population strategy within the Scottish government. He has also experience working either for the third sector or other Scottish bodies inside this government, and we like the approach he's going to explain us, because in Scotland they have this administrative unit that is transversal, so it's not related just to a single department that is working with the whole Scottish government. And also, and for us as academics, it's very interesting that they have an academic advisory board. So they are facing these academics and discussing with them the policies that the Scottish government is implementing. So we are going first to give them like 10 minutes each one to present both experiences, and then I will start asking some questions, but also you feel free to raise your hands and also ask any question you are interested in. So if you want, Hilma, you can first start you. You want the... Okay.
Yeah, maybe
would that be easier? Yeah, sure.
Okay, I promise to be pretty brief, so I'm not going to go into the very details of this research project, but more talk a little bit of like how we designed it, what was the idea behind it, and then what we learned while we were doing it. Not just about the results, but just about doing this kind of research. So we already heard a little bit about Nordregio, what it is interesting about where I work and about this kind of applied research is that since we're independent, but we're under the Nordic Council of Ministers, and that means that about half of our work is done in close contact with these kind of public officials, regional planners, municipal authorities, so people who work with different type of regional issues, problems such as depopulation, and then designing research projects together with them, sharing information and so on in these type of thematic groups, as we call them. And this project on smart adaptation to rural realities was a project like this. And what we wanted to do was discover what smart adaptation means. Quite quickly we noticed that also in the Nordic countries, you don't really find strategies that would mention the word smart adaptation. Or if they talk about population decline, it is kind of like how to reverse it, how to not have population decline. But then we still felt like we know, this is the policy brief that we wrote, and we felt like we know that all Nordic countries, as in all European countries, know about this phenomenon, they experience this phenomenon, and also have a lot of shrinking regions. So this is the situation in the Nordic countries, and as you see, for example, in Finland, where I'm from, about 75% of the municipalities are shrinking. So we know that even if people don't wish to discuss it, it is happening. So then people who work in these regions, or especially people who work in these municipalities, they have to somehow in practice deal with it. So then we came up with this thought that there's probably this smart adaptation approaches happening even if people don't write it down anywhere in this form of strategy. So with smart adaptation, we came to think of any kind of approaches that mean not trying to reverse population decline, but kind of work with it, find a way how to have well-being, how to have vital places that are in decline. And how we worked in this project that was relatively short, like all the projects always are, was to work with this kind of network of different workshops. And these are the municipalities and regions that we chose, or mainly municipalities and regions who answered our emails, because it was also sometimes difficult to get people to talk about smart adaptation, talk about shrinkage also with us in a bit more informal way. But we did get 22 municipalities, 12 regions, other experts, and then we did national focus groups, one big workshop in Stockholm, and we talked about different practical solutions that they do in these different places with an idea that maybe we find something that is applicable to all Nordic countries, and also that they can just share knowledge among each other. And I'm not going to go very deep into these policy action areas. I can say maybe more generally now that what kind of emerged was that a lot of regions and municipalities, they do suffer from the stigma related to the population decline. That if you get the stigma of being a place that is in decline, then there's the risk that then you also lose a lot of funding, because why fund a place that is in decline? You don't seem attractive anymore. People who still live there feel negatively towards their home, and that also affects on the actual work that people are trying to do. So there would be this need for more kind of a support, strategic, long-term planning, and also maybe a change in the way that we talk about population decline. so that there would be less of a stigma. And then we were also thinking about this type of work, of working in research on population decline and with the policymakers, that as it is kind of a problem that is not talked openly. For example, we found municipalities that had very interesting programs or strategies, that there was this one person that was engaged in it, but then they didn't get a permission to attend our workshops and just spread the knowledge in a way for a reason, this or that. It was hard to say. But for this reason, it was still good. It was a good way to build trust in this kind of workshop setting where you meet people several times. And then I think with the Nordic countries, it helps that the countries are rather similar when it comes to their, like, how decisions are made, how it looks like. So it's easy to put people together in the same room and they can kind of assume that all these people will understand what I talk about. And then it can also help people in their own work if they hear something like, this is how it's done in Norway, so then it's easier for me to make a point about it in Sweden because I have a backing from another Nordic country. So as a method, this type of a thing worked pretty well in addressing a tricky issue like this. A problem that we always have in our kind of applied research is, of course, where is the line between co-learning and co-creation, meaning that we want to be very open and engaging when we talk with policymakers, but what we don't want to do is to get someone's kind of main political interest as our result, if it's not our result. So then keep the independence in some way. But yeah, that's a short overview for now.
No, you need the computer, so
Can I plug mine in?
Okay.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
it works incredible.
That never happens.
Never.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me along to this really important event to participate in discussion and hopefully just give you a quick overview over the next few minutes about the Scottish Government's broader work on population and demographics, but particularly how we are looking to flexibly put in place policies to address the challenge of depopulation. As Vicente mentioned, it's 3 years since we hosted Vicente in Scotland, and it's 2.5 years since I visited here to meet with Vicente, regional government officials, and see examples of how depopulation is being responded to here in Aragon. So it's really, really good to be back. Before I get into the detail of the policy work we've done, and want to put a bit of context in place for Scotland. So like many other places, we're facing a set of really long-term demographic challenges. Perhaps the most stark of those is the current trend and future projection that all of Scotland's population growth is set to come from inward migration from the rest of the UK and from internationally. Our projected population growth, even in that context, is slower than many other parts of the UK as well. We have a birth rate of only around 1.3, which is not unusual among high-income countries, but with more deaths than births and an ageing population, we face a really specific set of challenges requiring a holistic policy response. And all of these challenges have significant implications for our economy, for our fiscal sustainability, and for our public services. And that's why the Scottish Government is committed to looking at these challenges in support of communities across our country. So I thought it might be helpful to give a bit of an overview of the structures, some of which Vicente touched on, that underpin our work around population and demography. So my team has both a policy and a secretariat function in support and delivery of this work. And we also now own some of the policy and delivery in this space as well. So, in 2019, the Scottish Government established a Ministerial Population Task Force. This is currently chaired by our Minister for Equalities. It consists of more than 10, I think it's about 15 Scottish ministers across a very wide range of Scottish Government portfolios at the moment. And it meets 4 times a year, and it aims to deliver the actions set out in the population strategy, which was published in 2021, and I'll speak about in a minute. This work looks to identify gaps across government where new bits of work can support a joined-up approach to demographic challenges. In the time since I have been in role, since early 2022, the task force has driven forward a broad range of work, including the development and delivery of Scotland's migration service to try and make Scotland an attractive place for businesses, investors and individuals to move to. And we have delivered our Addressing Depopulation Action Plan, which I'll speak about in more detail. Just for a little bit more context on that, we have an official level programme board which sits underneath that task force, and that includes a lot of our partners, including the overarching body for local government in Scotland, business enterprise and local development agencies, which are situated across the country. So there's a multi-actor role in taking forward these challenges. It's not just government, it's not just municipalities, it's a broad range of actors delivering in this space. And there's a really specific interface as well between economic drivers, work to deliver economic ambitions locally, and the population outcomes which are linked to that. As Vicente mentioned, my team also provides extensive support for what we call an independent expert advisory group on migration and population. This group is chaired by Professor Becca Kay from the think tank Migration Policy Scotland and is now into its third 3-year iteration. It has 3 core functions. It develops commissioned reports to enhance the evidence base around population and migration as relevant to Scotland. It supports a policy development process that flows from these reports, and we have key policy products we've developed in the past few years which have followed on directly from work undertaken by this expert group, notably our rural visa pilot and our asylum right to work pilot proposals, which you can see on the slide. We also use the group's expertise and linkages to support our broader international engagement in respect of population, and that reflects the fact that there are challenges here which are different but similar, and likewise elsewhere around a number of countries. The evidence base which our expert advisory group has contributed towards setting out fundamentally underpins our overall population strategy. That was published in March 2021, and you can see the 4 pillars of that strategy on the slide. And the context of that relates to a policy response to all of the key demographic trends Scotland is facing. And nominally, these ambitions are that Scotland is the best place to raise a family in the context of record low birth rates, that while the population ages, that population is able to live longer and healthier lives, that in the context of freedom of movement having ended and an increasingly challenging UK immigration system, Scotland is able to attract people with the skills that are needed here to make a really positive contribution. And specifically in the context of depopulation, that spatial component of Scotland's population distribution is considered in our policy work. Just before I go on, I just want to quickly mention we know that Scotland is not alone in facing these challenges. Many of them mirror broader global trends, so we have a commitment within our strategy to engage internationally. Today's meeting is part of that, but it's an extensive part of our work. And we've forged links with a range of international partners, multiple parts of Spain actually now, the Nordics, Japan, and through our diplomatic network in London as well. So it's great to be here. It builds on that commitment, and really important to be here. Looking specifically at our depopulation work, though, which is I guess why everybody really is here today. There's a bit of context here. So some parts of Scotland, particularly in the west and southwest of the country, and I have a map on a future slide, so don't worry if you've not looked at a map of Scotland before, but particularly in the west and southwest of the country are facing or are projected to experience population decline. And we know there are many factors and drivers influencing this, some of which are unique to Scotland's island communities, but not all. So we did a piece of development work through 2023 and into 2024 to undertake to develop an action plan to address depopulation, and that has put forward a data-driven and place-based and locally driven approach to designing and delivering policy interventions to support population attraction and retention within these communities. So there's a few things here just to mention. I think we specifically chose the word addressing rather than tackling or fighting depopulation, partially in the context of some of the comments you made about stigma, because some of our feedback from communities was really clear that supporting people to live in place as best as possible is possibly more important than simply seeking to attract a huge range of new people and their families to an area facing population decline. So that nuanced approach around wording is important, that aims to build resilient and sustainable communities, especially in areas of lower population density, such as our highlands and islands. And it also creates space for both adaptive approaches and efforts to repopulate affected areas, which using the word tackling or fighting would not intrinsically create those conditions. So as you can see on the screen there, this is the definition of addressing depopulation which we've set out at a national level within Scottish Government and with our partners. Front and centre in the action plan is an acknowledgement that local communities are best placed to understand nuances around challenges that they are facing locally, as well as what responses will be most effective. That's underpinned the programme of delivery that we've put in place since publication. And we really want to enable communities through this new programme of work, driving work and our resources directly where appropriate, but crucially, and possibly slightly unusually for central government, looking to get out the way and let communities deliver what they think will work for them wherever possible. We've got a strong evidence base to underpin this. In 2022, we commissioned our expert advisory group that I mentioned to undertake initially a research project around the possible application of a zonal approach when responding to community-level depopulation. Over the course of that year, when our experts undertook that work and reflecting the fact that they do work independently of government, they came to a broader conclusion that while targeted zonal approaches might be useful, they need to be able to respond with nuance to local areas' needs and priorities. So the overarching findings of this research can be seen on the slide, and I'll just take 2 minutes to go through that just now. There is no quick fix to population challenges. Indeed, some of the presentations in the last session talked about certain depopulation trends going back centuries, not just over the past 4 or 5 or 10 years. And I suppose that context is really important. In the Highlands and Islands area of Scotland, we have a legacy of outmigration, some of which is driven by a period of time known as the Highland Clearances in the 17 and 1800s, which had tens of thousands of people of very well established communities leaving those areas by virtue of a direction that came from elsewhere. So when we're looking at this problem now, the most important thing to begin implementing looking forward is long-term coherence across policy, and that's really important between national, regional and local actors. But where we're delivering for very specific small local communities where they're depopulating, local leadership is really, really important. In the context of applying a zonal approach, our experts told us that this could work for discrete areas within those zones, but we need to be very mindful of unintended consequences on neighbouring areas, whereby success in one place could cause failure somewhere else, and that would not be an intended outcome we would like. And then more broadly, and once again, international learning is really important to inform how we take forward this approach. Is that called? So the approach that we've undertaken in delivering this wants to create conditions that are pragmatic and sensible in the policy context that we operate within right now, and ensure that we do not set fascinating goals which are impossible to achieve, such as, for example, choosing an arbitrary historical date and committing to restore local populations back to that level. Specifically with regard to areas affected by depopulation, we're not setting out a specific Scottish Government objective for any given geographic area, nor setting out whether an area should aim for specific outcomes. But we have set out support for local interventions which are place-based, person-centred, with communities enabled and supported to thrive. And we think that that enables us to deliver a strategic policy which enables both mitigative and adaptive approaches depending on local priorities. Our expert group frames this approach as strategic mitigation, namely that when thinking about a rural population policy more broadly, we should ensure continued economic and social viability for communities. That does not imply repopulation or stabilisation of all localities, artificially blocking the evolution of settlement patterns in a changing technological, economic and mobility context. Success would primarily rather be measured in terms of community well-being rather than necessarily demographic or economic growth. So what does delivery look like? We are now coming to the back of a 2-year programme of initial delivery. This has mostly been encompassed with a package of new and continuing funding from within the Scottish Government, both from my team and rural and island colleagues. And we've partnered with local authorities across affected parts of Scotland to deliver targeted new measures around depopulation. We invited these areas to submit bids to say what they would do with a package of funding, and in every case that funding has been taken forward without intervention or steer from central government about that, building on the evidence base that says local areas do know best when it comes to addressing these challenges. So there are a broad range of projects, I think 10 or 11 in total at the moment, and ministers have been really clear that they wish to be led by local priorities. So what does that look like? There's a very strong differentiated approach across the different parts of Scotland. And to just give a quick flavour, in the Western Isles, which is this very top left section that you can see of the Scottish map there, around just to the north of the text that says Uist, they've taken forward work to deliver skills training for parents with childcare provided alongside that skills training. It was identified that there was a barrier to upskilling locally by virtue of people having children and then that prohibiting them from undertaking skills development. So this was a very direct policy response to give free childcare during the time that individuals were undertaking this skills training so that they could upskill and stand a better chance of being able to remain in place within that area. Our Highland partners, and as you can see that's the kind of north of the mainland of Scotland, have undertaken some exploratory work around rural childcare provision. We have a really broad offer on childcare in Scotland, but we do recognise that there are different needs in rural places, and so there's been exploratory work undertaken, and they're hoping to begin a pilot soon about a novel childcare model to support population retention there. Housing is a big challenge across many parts of Scotland, whether urban and growing or rural and depopulating, but specifically work in Argyll and Bute, which is in that west portion of the map, as well as Dumfries and Galloway in the southwest, has taken forward specific work around addressing the challenge of second homes, holiday homes, and the impact of a declining rental sector for long-term accommodation, all of which are understood to be drivers towards creating the conditions for people to feel forced to leave those areas. So really, this is all about understanding what makes a community sustainable in terms of its population challenges. Just one last quick thing to mention, again, in terms of the governance structure supporting this, we've established a delivery group. This comprises all of our partners that are involved in delivery, and we meet with them 3 or 4 times a year to talk through success and failure within the projects to understand what might work now and going forward into the future. And we're actually, as I said, we're coming to the end of a 2-year funded programme at the moment. That ends at the end of March next year. So we're currently working with our partners to reflect on that learning, undertake monitoring and evaluation, and look to harness new statistical projections to identify, 1, what future work could take place in the communities we already work with, and 2, are there any new areas that we could look to work with in the context of this work? There are some areas, and interestingly in the Scottish context, there is a small but growing number of urban settings with reasonable proximity to major cities, but which are facing challenges around depopulation, and that feels very distinct from the rural challenge. So we're exploring how we might look to take forward that strand of work going forward as well. And all being well, we would look to launch that new programme of activity from April next year. All of that work will be overseen in interaction with our expert group through our ministerial task force. And yeah, I hope that's been a helpful, very quick overview of the work, especially the work that's taken place since we last met. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Well, I just want to raise two questions to our two guests, and then I will give you a lot of time to ask questions, and just in case you don't have any doubt, I will go back again. So the first, in fact, you have already answered some of my questions, but the first point is about the interaction between academics and policymakers. And inside this area, you have politicians and also, let's say, technicians or just official working inside the different administrative bodies. So I would like, because in both cases, you have this interaction between research and policy making. I would like to ask you if you can share your experience about how has worked this interaction between the academia and this let's say governmental or any kind of governmental sphere.
Yeah, we noticed, or we also heard from the people that we worked with, they really weren't politicians in the way that they weren't elected in elections. And they often also said that it's hard to get politicians that need to be elected every 4 years to talk about this, because who wants to have an election campaign where one of your messages is that our population is going down, let's work with it. Everyone wants to have an optimistic message. So then, yeah, I think there is this difference that people who don't have to be afraid of their work security in the same sense, then they are often a bit more free in talking about it. But then, of course, then they maybe lack the mandate, or just they lack the resources. They're just one person who is supposed to deal with this in one municipality, so then they just are not able to solve it either. So there is this type of gap.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in what you've said there about the challenges that come with short-term political cycles when we're in the context of, as I say, some trends which are decades or centuries old, some trends which are more recent as well. But I think that is a notable challenge in the space. I think that in terms of the relationship between academics and the policy space, I just reflect a couple of things. So firstly, there is cross-party consensus within Scotland about the importance of population, its interface with key drivers in that space, such as migration. So there is cross-party recognition of the importance of that. What unsurprisingly, though, will kind of comes from that is that the different parts of the political spectrum have different ideas about how they would address those challenges. So I would probably just make the point in response to that role of the academic space is that it being distinctly independent of government, and we stress that point in everything we say and do about our expert group, is that it is independent, is that evidence base being independent supports broader constructive dialogue, less political dialogue in the policy space. And to be totally honest, our population strategy, discrete migration policy proposals, our addressing depopulation action plan, which are all the big items which this programme of work has taken forward in the last 5 or 6 years, all of those have been completely underpinned and almost follow to the word the independent academic advice we've received. So that relationship is really strong, and actually we rely on it in order to make viable evidence-based policy within government. So yeah, it's a very positive relationship. And the one other thing I would possibly just say about the relationship that our academic colleagues have with the kind of broader policy area is that our expert advisory group have good relations with the UK government's own Migration Advisory Committee, which is an equivalent organisation for the UK government. That has been really, really helpful because there is that independent and in good faith interaction between academics supporting policy there, which has at times been really helpful when the political environment between Scottish ministers and UK ministers has been very, very difficult, not least since in the migration space since the vote to leave the European Union. So that's been a really useful forum for academics being able to facilitate broader dialogue in the policy space. So it's really positive.
Thank you. My second question is about, all the discussion about bottom-up policies, top-down policies, and it's very clear from both of your presentation that you emphasize in the Scottish, in your case, that you are inside this population task force, that you really emphasize the bottom-up approach, and you are mostly trying to discuss with the local authorities, local communities, similar also in the Nordic case, what they want to go and what they want to do. And this is quite different because the Spanish approach is here different governments approve laws, and these laws has like hundreds of measures against not on the population, and finally the communication and the interaction with the local authorities and local communities is mostly weak. So I would like also you can explain a little bit more about this. Why did you choose this approach, and how you feel is working in your both of your cases?
Yeah, I would say in my case as a method, it works since it's often something that doesn't really have a shape, that you know that there is this thing that is happening and you're trying to make shape of it. So then you can kind of, when you do a very bottom-up thing, that you kind of see what's coming from the people that you're working with, and then you don't neglect the experiences of people who maybe already feel like they are often neglected by the capital region, for example. And then you see the nuances that you also mentioned. For example, in some of our workshops, people talk that they also maybe don't really like the word smart adaptation, because as a word it sounds like something that comes a bit like from the top, and then you just have to adapt to it. And they would rather talk about something like rural transition, where you would take into account also the green transition, the digital transition, and then the population change, because maybe in a municipality it's one person who has to juggle all these transitions at the same time. So for them it makes sense that in the strategic thinking you would see all of these. So then when you talk with people, then you see the connections that you wouldn't see if you're kind of thinking more in the policy silos. And then for the politicians, it also does make sense to think of a more bottom-up way, because then when you have to do very unpopular decisions, even something like closing down a school, which I feel like is the most unpopular decision to make. So then in these situations, if then you can maybe balance things in a way that you can do some kind of like this participatory budgeting, as it's called, of giving people some kind of a choice of, okay, now we are also saving some money because there is less people. So if we would make some new investment to serve the people who are here, what kind of a thing should it be? And then that can give us the sense of like, yeah, having your voice heard in some way.
I think we've touched on it across the two presentations, but I think one thing that feels really sensitive and important in this space is terminology. Terminology really matters. How communities perceive that as differentiated from policymakers feels really important. You referenced it there in terms of a response to the term smart mitigation, what that might feel like in a place as distinct from in a research institute within government. So that's one point I think is important. We got some really explicit feedback within our policy engagement around our depopulation plan, which was very strong and strongly negative about continued use of the word remote in the context of communities, on the basis that there's an assumption, and it's a levered assumption, that places are remote from centres of power, which is to some degree true. But it's fair to say that a community on one of these islands on the map here is as remote from me in the capital city Edinburgh in a policy space as I am from them. But that's not the way that that's interpreted in public discourse. So just a point on the sensitivity of language in this space, which we've got into a lot through this policy programme. The next thing to mention, I suppose, is we've talked about this before, Vicente, but the legal backdrop which can underpin the policy space here. It's probably worth saying that in respect of depopulation specifically, there is no legal underpinning at present to the work in Scotland. It is entirely through using existing levers, and so there is nothing new in the legal space there in the context of population. Neither is there anything legal in the space from a Scottish Government perspective in respect of our challenges around migration, because the immigration system is entirely reserved to the UK Government as well. So the whether it is to do with the bottom-up policy interventions around depopulation, which my team oversees, or whether it is to do with the calls we make of the UK Government to modify the UK immigration system in response to Scotland's distinct needs, particularly in our rural communities, that there is no legal lever in that space being pulled by the Scottish Government. One, because we haven't done it, and one, because we can't do it because of the constitutional setup in Scotland. So I think it's a really important point to reflect on about the fact that this is about pulling the policy levers that are available. It's about working with some partners, some of whom are more challenging than others, some of whom are more favourable than others. But that legal underpinning to the work in Scotland that you've mentioned many times exists in Spain and within parts of Spain isn't there's no commonality with that in the Scottish context.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just stopping myself, and yes, it's time for question for the floor. So if you want to ask any question, we have here a microphone, and
Okay, and then I will start. Thank you so much, Mike and Hilma. That was very, very interesting. I actually have a question maybe for Mike first. You mentioned history. I'm a historian, so I was actually very amused when you mentioned like this long-term effects. And I was wondering, what do you think historians can actually contribute? Obviously, Vicente is known for his historical work, but if you can give maybe some specific examples. I'm asking this because in my project with my team, we actually work on Finland, Ukraine, and the Netherlands historically. We look how depopulation happened in the context of the welfare state, so starting 1950s, which is very recent history. So I think there I probably have an idea, but if you can, from your policy perspective, can give us some clues, that would be helpful, kind of how history can actually help. And for Hilma, I also have a question, because you mentioned the smart shrinking, and I was just wondering, what examples did you find which were interesting for Finland or other Nordic regions that you think could be, that maybe were unexpected? Obviously, I'm going to read the report, but something that you can maybe highlight that could be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's a fascinating one, actually, and I'm happy to share with you and encourage you to have a look at both some of that historical contextualization within our depopulation plan and also our broader population strategy as well, because within the kind of opening sections of those documents, we do make reference to that much, much longer term historical kind of trend that's within Scotland. I mean, just to give a very quick example of this, there are some communities, and on the map, in fact, it's the very, very top purple bit in the northwest of the Highlands of Scotland that you can see there, where there are communities in that area who, as a result of the Highland Clearances Programme that ran, as I say, in the 1800s, some of those communities had populations which were decimated by those activities and have never returned back to those levels. We work with one community, it's an even smaller subsection of that top purple section you can see up there, where they had a population 2 centuries ago of 12,000 or 11,000. Currently that population sits at 3,500, and it has never got near to those levels again. And indeed, if you drive around those areas, I was lucky enough to visit some of those areas over summer through policy engagement, and you arrive in particular parts of those communities and you see signage, and you see kind of stoneworks which essentially memorialize those places as having previously been so prominent for certain communities, certain family groupings, etc. And that, to some degree, isn't the case now. And you see, I mean, the telling point of this now is that there are more people of Scottish diaspora origin in Canada than live in Scotland, and a great degree of that is as a result of long-term trends around outmigration from some of those parts of Scotland. So there are real lessons that we can learn from history there, in terms of the fact that we are still living with the impacts of that in communities 200 years later, and even longer in some cases. So I think, in terms of where we can learn from historians, it sets the backdrop for so much of the story in some of these parts of Scotland. And a lot of these parts of Scotland that were affected by elements of that rapid forced migration and forced depopulation in those times are the areas that my team is working with now, not through a lens of reversing what happened during the clearances, because that's not pragmatic at all in a modern context, but it is ultimately a lot of the historical backdrop for it. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. I had some time to think. It was difficult because I feel like I could go in several different directions, but maybe one of the things that came to my mind was this nuance, and how different something like depopulation feels in something like an island community or then a city, because we had some people representing very small islands, at least globally speaking, and then they often said that we feel like we don't need much more support from the state, for example, that we have been working with our own community and having to be very resilient, for also related to history, for all of our history. And maybe now it's shrinking, but it has never been like this very buzzing hub of population. Whereas then maybe small cities, it feels like there is a lot more decisions that you have to make, and it also maybe becomes a lot more visible if people are leaving, and then there might be these parts of town that look deserted, and it can really have a really big impact on if people want to move around in that part of town. And then I think it was a Danish participant who said that he's trying to push for this way where you could then demolish these parts that have been empty for a long while, then just to make a more centralized city center and put all, for example, all the shops and the cafes closer to each other, so that then it would look like there are people and you can go out and see people and so on. So yeah.
Yes. Good morning. Very interesting both experiences. My question is a geographical question. I was wondering, the question is for both, for Mike and for Hilma. Under these strategies of recuperation, are you focusing on recuperating any specific size? So the question is about the settlement, the smallest villages, or is any territorial strategy to recuperate the smallest one or intermediate villages? So in any kind of territorial strategy? Thank you.
I can go first because I don't really have anything to say, unfortunately. I think for us, we were interested in communities of any size, basically, because they all have to plan their service deliveries and so on and so forth.
I think it's probably worth starting the answer to your question by being quite honest and upfront about the limited resource which is available in order to fund these projects in the first instance. We are not talking hundreds of millions of pounds or billions or anything in that space. We're talking a modest amount of resource because these initial projects have been undertaken as pilots, as pathfinders. So that it's been with a small amount of funding, around about £500,000, so about 650,000 euro per year total for the initial tranche of projects. So that's important context, because what we want to do is have that resource go as far as possible, but be realistic about what it can achieve, because it's not enormous amounts of money. So that first point is important to make. The second point is that in terms of the territories or territorial kind of size of areas being targeted through the work, it varies from project to project, in some instances by geographical limitations, such as the constraints of an island as distinct from mainland. So that is a constraint in and of itself. In addition to that, what we have done, as I say, is be led by local authorities. So some local authorities have undertaken work which covers their entire geographical area, but all the local authority geographies in Scotland are not the same physical size. So we have partners in the Inverclyde area where their work is targeting the entire area, but it's quite geographically small because that's a small local authority area. On the other hand, the Highland local authority area, which isn't even demonstrated in full on the map you can see up here. The Highland geographical area is the size of Belgium. It's the largest local authority subdivision in Europe in geographical size. Enormous, absolutely in the size of a country that has a population of 17 million, and yet the Highlands there has a population, I think, in the kind of 200,000s, and is absolutely enormous, and large parts of it are quite sparsely populated. But the point specifically I would make on size of settlement and what we're trying to achieve through this is that with limited resource, you can make a bigger difference in an area if the population is, say, 40, and you manage to stop 2 families leaving because they can't access childcare, or the local school shuts down, or something like that. If you manage to preserve that population at 40 instead of it declining to 32 or 30, that has a much bigger impact on local community cohesion than a bigger place of 20,000 losing those same 8 individuals. So a lot of our targeting has ended up being in small rural and island communities where we are looking to make small differences in absolute numbers, but which proportionally for a given area makes a big difference to its population sustainability. I hope that answers your question.
Any other question?
Well, thank you very much for your expositions. They were extremely good. And I will try to explain myself, excuse me, because my English is quite bad. But I like especially in the last slide or previous of Hilma, you wrote to share the same language. What it means for politicians, for research, for stakeholders, because in conferences like this, you see at the beginning, there are politicians, they say this is a challenge extremely important, but they never stay here. Something similar, and we can see the opposite point of view. For academics, it's not a good trophy to be in real plans for rural plans. It's better to write a good paper, a supposed good paper, and so on. So I think that we are like in different planets. So deeping in the first question that told Vicente, and I say when the same language, what does it mean? They understand your conceptual references, you understand the problems they have, and give value to the knowledge which comes from the reality, from the experience, because for us, if it's not conceptualized, it's not valid. So if you can say something about that, then thank you.
Yeah, that is actually something we are working with, or we are trying to figure out a lot, is just how to get them to listen to what we have to say, and in what format does the message have to be. Very often, even people who are in our reference groups who work in the ministries, but you notice if you send them a report, they don't read it. You send them a policy brief, they still don't read it. So it is a lot of, I think, just using different channels. If you get someone to talk with you for something like 10 minutes, then it can have a bigger impact than that you get them to receive something, but then you're not really sure at what point the attention span stops. So it's, I think just trying to find different venues to talk with them, maybe ask, do you have something like, sometimes they have like a lunch seminar kind of a thing, try to get yourself invited, or then just force them to be a part of a reference group, then talk about something for half an hour, ask specific advice that this is what we have found out, and does this sound true to you? By asking advice, it's a good way of having them to actually think about it. And also a lot of translation between political lingo and academic lingo. So I notice a lot of academic concepts that I think are pretty clear. It can, I'm so used to it, so it can sound like jargon to the politicians, whereas their words, for me, it can sound a bit empty. And then I realized that this is actually a key word in the policy document, so if I use it, it will then get people's attention. So yeah, there is a lot of translating your message in various venues and trying to find different ways to find a hook on just getting a little bit of attention, and then getting just the key messages through, and then maybe that leads to someone actually going to the data as well.
Thank you very much for your presentation, both. Well, I would like to know a little more about education. How is the situation, not about the education as a service, if not to consider a little more about the connection between the studies plan and the rural areas? There is something, is there some contextualization? Are you working about it as institution in Scotland and in Nordic countries? Is doing something from education in order to to rethinking the population.
Sorry, do you mean education?
Educational system, studies plan.
But do you mean
educational system?
Do you mean education on depopulation or education as a way to work with depopulation?
Well, education like a mandatory education.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, I'm afraid.
I think they're thinking if I understand that more than taking education as a service is okay, I don't know if I catch the idea, but I think it's more that understanding just education as a service is also to understand the role of education in these communities and building strategies on the population.
Exactly.
Is this right?
Yeah, thinking of education in schools, what is happening? There is some special action in order to promote the connection between the considering the situation in rural areas, to acknowledge, to recognize the value, to think about a future in this context, in this way. There is something else that a national curriculum, a national studies plan, or there is there a possibility to contact with the context where schools are?
Okay, now
I don't know, maybe it's
I think I got it, or I will answer how I think I got it, and you can say if it doesn't answer the question. I think in the Nordic countries, and now especially in Finland, there is a lot of kind of related to this linking the smart adaptation and the green transition and the digital transition. So there is a lot of programs that try to make it possible for young people to remain in their region or in their municipality, and then work with the vocational school system, so the schools that lead to a certain profession, so that they could, for example, if there's some kind of a green transition activity related to wind parks, they would need certain type of engineers, that then there would be also an educational program in that region, and it would be possible to attend to it maybe in a hybrid format, so partly digitally, or then maybe there would be some kind of a transport or some kind of a collaboration between different schools, so that the closer school could offer some of the courses, so that you don't have to travel that far, and then you can build these kind of new competencies in the region that are needed there, and that also help the region to also take part in the green transition, for example.
Thank you.
Similarly, hoping I answer the question correctly. So, a couple of things on this. Firstly, it is the local authority responsibility to provide education for people that live in those areas, and we are working closely within Scottish Government with our education policy colleagues to understand if there's anything we can do so that decisions around educational provision in rural and island Scotland are able to take into account future population challenges that may come from a decision to close a school. So that's the first point, distinct from what is being taught in the schools, just that overarching point about recognising the role that educational infrastructure in a town or village or city, wherever, plays in supporting sustainable communities. There is this thought, I suppose, that if you make a decision to close a school in an area, that will stop people from moving to that area if they want to or they already have children. So it's a practical point around that, first to mention, particularly around ensuring that skills are able to be developed in a locality in order to address population challenges. One thing to mention, and it's quite similar to what you were just saying there, Hilma. Our expert group at the moment is undertaking a piece of work about the transition to net zero in the slide's gone, the northeast part of Scotland, which for 50 years has been dominated by the oil and gas industry, and is undergoing a process now to transition towards net zero over the coming decades. And so our experts right now are actually looking at to undertake a report which will look at what people will we need in those areas in order to undertake that transition to net zero, and how will we go about that? Will that be through reskilling or upskilling existing individuals that live in the area, either those people already in the labour market or people in schools? And those people could be young children at the moment, but with a view to future participation in the labour market, and what skills are needed to retain them within that area within our population. But there is another component to that, which is where, if there's an instance where the domestic skills delivery in Scotland cannot meet that need to deliver a just transition to net zero, how do we ensure that we have the people through migration in that part of Scotland in order to make a success of that? So there's a lot of connectivity between current delivery in the education system, making sure the education system is delivering the right thing in the right place for those individuals. But where that cannot meet the full gap that's coming, how do we use other levers such as migration in order to make those communities sustainable for the longer term? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other question? So if I'm just taking advantage of this opportunity because Mike, you mentioned something interesting we have been discussing during this conference. Is the idea, if I'm not wrong, you said something like, we are not worried about numbers, we're worried about well-being of the people. And also, Hilma, you mentioned the idea of adapting to a new scenario. So we were discussing yesterday about these issues, and my point is, if we recognize that numbers are not our priority, well-being is more important, and we are going to live in a different world that we had before, is how you deal with local communities. You mentioned, both of you mentioned the idea of avoiding stigmas and avoiding this depressing views of our world is going to disappear, and looking more than an opportunity, taking advantage of this opportunity to build different communities, just taking advantage of this new situation. So my point is, in your case, is the government convinced that numbers are not in fact important, and the government is facing more this approach of well-being, freedom to choose for the people, and also how both of you, how you deal this point with local communities, what they think are not really more worried than you about numbers. And anyway, because the point is, I think there is a kind of consensus in the academia about this new paradigm. I mean, it's growing, this consensus, but the point is the coupling between the academia thinking and in some cases how politicians approach to this point.
So I would say that there's a slight point of nuance to take at face value what you just said about not being worried about numbers. So just on that point, I think in respect of the work we do with communities, the Scottish Government position is not to set arbitrary population targets around, for example, a place that was 10,500 people, now 3,500. Should it be 10,500 again? That's not the position. However, the one thing which we have agreed through establishing this programme of work and building on the evidence which our academics produced for us is that if we are working with the local authority in that area, and if that local authority's priority is to raise a population level from X to Y amount, we will support that. But if another local authority area says, we're not interested in that, we just want to look at preserving the conditions and service delivery for the retained population that's there now, we will equally support that as well. So that's a point of nuance about the Scottish Government's position in this, and that's reflected in some of the different projects which we're working on, because some of them have a more distinct repopulation lens on them towards increasing the population. Some of them are more about how do we stop people leaving, which is a slightly different thing. Now, there's a long tail to this work though, where, for example, if our colleagues in Highland design and deliver a childcare model that stops 2 or 4 families feeling compelled to leave that area and compelled to move to a city where they might think there's better service provision, that's a short-term win in terms of retaining a population in an area and is the initial ambition. But if you also test and deliver a good rural childcare model that means that a place hasn't lost people and is a sustainable community on those terms, that makes it more attractive, and in time should mean that that's a place that people might think, I'd quite like to live there because the childcare model is better. So I suppose it's a little bit about thinking pragmatically, following what the local direction is in the first instance, but ultimately if we get right a number of these projects, all of these places should become more attractive. So it's not with a view to the population going up by X% in the next 5, 10, 15 years, but should just become an easier and better choice for people to choose to call home. Okay.
Yeah, I just largely agree. It is very difficult to get someone behind on anything related to degrowth. It's the same as with this green transition discussion. And then sometimes you also have to maybe acknowledge that you may know that you are right about something, that the demographics and the statistics are on your side, but it doesn't really matter if you are factually right if people don't want to hear your message. Mm-hmm. So then I think it is better than just to refocus, for example, in this retaining people. A bit like when it comes to fertility, it's hard to tell someone to have a kid who is not interested in having a kid, but if you focus more on people who wish to have children but feel like they can't afford it or they can't arrange it, then it's a much more pragmatic approach, and then it's also usually based on more realistic scenarios. So then you can kind of refocus it a little bit without expecting people to have a different worldview than they wish to have.
Any other question? So if there are not more questions, yesterday I tried to avoid you drinking coffee because it's not very healthy, and I made a mistake with the time of the secretary of general secretary of the minister presentation, and today I noticed that we have a coffee break in a few minutes. So even if it's not healthy, I know you like it, so you can go and drink as much as you can. And just I would like to remind you that at 12:30 we'll have a lecture by Professor Michael Boots. He's our distinguished guest also in this conference. And just I want to finish thanking Hilma and Mike for the presentation. I have some feeling that in some areas we are lagging behind. At least my understanding of the Scottish actions in this area is impressive. The work you are doing, I would like also we move in this direction. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.